Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Follow the stories we're talking about by visiting breakpoint.org, where you'll find commentaries and resources every single day to help you think and live like a Christian in today's culture. John, the first story that we want to hit today is one that's likely going to shape American politics and law for decades to come, and that is, of course, the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett as the newest member of the U.S. Supreme Court just a couple of days ago, tipping the balance on the court to it may be historic, actually, 6-3 conservative majority. And there's no telling what kind of cases could end up at the court that will be decided by this conservative majority and reshape the way that the United States works for a whole generation here.
No, I mean, everyone's predicting, they know, particularly those on the left, predicting, essentially an apocalypse and a loss of our way of life. And I think we answered a question on Tuesday or Wednesday on our question and answer segment about, whether being an originalist like Amy Coney Barrett not only claims to be, but clearly explained what that meant during her confirmation hearings, which if I'm a law professor with that persuasion, even if I'm a law professor of, of the other persuasion, seeing it more as positive law than any sort of kind of moral law or, an originalist interpretation of original documents and so on, I'm going to hold that up. That's the new teaching thing. It was such a clear, articulate take. And of course, it still brought up accusations that, we're going to put people back in slavery, or we're going to put people, an entire segment of the population back to the originalist language of, partial, humanness or citizenship or something like that. And of course, none of that is what originalism means. But look, this is, there's so many lessons here. The most obvious one is elections have consequences. And there has been on a political level, Mitch McConnell might go down in history as the most effective, Senate leader of our lifetime, and how he was able to pull this off. And, it's certainly a sore spot because of how he handled the Merrick Garland nomination. Suddenly those who aren't originalist are appealing to tradition and vice versa. I mean, look, there's so much here. Elections do matter. And this is one of the reasons that they do. What I really appreciated about the swearing in ceremony there at the White House was a couple things. I mean, we have to note that we have an African-American Supreme Court justice swearing in a female Supreme Court justice. That was a stunning visual sight to see.
First African-American Supreme Court justice, correct? And the fifth female Supreme Court justice.
Yeah. And what's incredible about that is something that is becoming more and more obvious. And we're going to talk about a story having to do with the Girl Scouts and Amy Coney Barrett here in just a second. But for those who really, often claim to value diversity, what's becoming more and more obvious is that what is meant by that is a diversity in appearance, not a diversity in ideology or thought. We had a situation this past week where Chelsea Handler, who is a talk show host on a pretty edgy kind of comedian, basically said to an African-American who had expressed really ambivalence towards Trump, not even that he was going to vote for him, and he certainly changed his mind. She literally said on television, I had to remind him that he was Black. Something that would be offensive, and it is offensive, something to say, because it's essentially you only count as an ethnic minority if you think like we think you should. If there was a Karen moment on television this year, that was it, right? This is a remarkable statement where a lot of times, Clarence Thomas is accused of not being, true to quote unquote his people, and because of his ideological differences. The ideological diversity is not allowed. It's the parent diversity that is allowed. Amy Coney Barrett being the same thing. She's widely been criticized for being anti-woman. As a woman, as someone who has embraced not only her being a woman, but the things biologically that go along with being a woman, like having babies, which is something that she has, demonstrated, and also nurturing and caring, in adoption, as her and her husband did. There's just a lot there that was just pictured on that screen. And I appreciated, I forget who said this. There was somebody who mentioned, look, this is the first, maybe it was President Trump in his opening remarks, said something along the lines of, this is the first female Supreme Court justice who has school-age children. That's a really remarkable thing in so many ways. So anyway, I thought it was a really moving ceremony. I did watch it and thought it was, really something to behold. The other interesting part of this too, Shane, I'm interested to hear what you think about this, is that there was a remarkable majority of people who at the end of these confirmation hearings believed she should be confirmed. And it did not match with the current left-right political divide and how these issues so often seem to break down when it comes to polling. She won over the hearts of an awful lot of people. Her kids probably won over as many, as she did, and that was a really cool thing to watch too. But most Americans, it was a significant majority, and those who, and there wasn't a significant minority. In other words, those that were against it, a significant portion were ambivalent. Those who were just flat out against it, it was a very small number. I think it was in the 30s. So it's a remarkable achievement, I think. And she's an incredible scholar. She's one of the bright legal minds in America. So Godspeed to her and her tenure. And she's dropping on the court with some important things coming in a short amount of time.
Well, despite that public approval for her, John, the thing that's interesting is her confirmation was one of the most partisan in history. Not a single Democratic senator voted to confirm her. Only one Republican abstained from the vote to confirm her. And that's really a very interesting commentary on where the parties are currently at. And the reaction to originalism was pretty shocking to me as well, John. She even took the opportunity during her confirmation to sort of re-articulate or allude to her originalist principles. She said that I'm declaring independence from personal beliefs and convictions as a judge. And at first, that may strike some of our listeners as thinking, what's this going to mean for something like Roe v. Wade? Originalism means that you enforce the Constitution and the law as it's written. And I happen to believe, as a pro-lifer, that not only is taking unborn life wrong, not only is it murder, but it's also unconstitutional. It doesn't line up with the actual rights that are enumerated in the U.S. Constitution. And Roe v. Wade and other cases that enshrine that in law made up rights that don't exist. And so there's two levels on which I'm excited about Justice Barrett. The first is that obviously she leans in my direction on the Constitution and on moral principles, and she just, her family looks a lot like my family. I like that, and her faith is my faith. It's in a broad sense. It's Christianity, and obviously she's Catholic. I'm Protestant, but there's so much to appreciate there. But the second level on which I appreciate her, and I think I really want to emphasize, is this originalist understanding of the law. The reason the court is such a big deal, John, the reason why we see the political polarization we see in these confirmation votes is that the court has been made this board of philosopher kings who essentially decide all our national disputes for us and then impose an answer on the whole population. That's not what the Supreme Court was designed to do by the founders. It was designed to enforce and apply the law as it's written. And Justice Barrett believes that. And it's wonderful to have someone on the court who understands what the court is actually for, instead of, sitting there and writing pronouncements about, the purpose of life and the meaning of the universe and all that. It's refreshing and it's exciting, and I'm glad to see her there. And those are really the two main reasons why.
Well, the court's not an additional legislative body, and that's too often the role that it's played, right? And you mentioned how Roe v. Wade was actually determined. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose seat Amy Coney Barrett, has filled, herself acknowledged on more than one occasion that how that was ruled was probably handled poorly in certain aspects.
It was
Uh,
jiggery pokery, as Amy Coney Barrett's mentor, Justice Scalia, might have said.
well, as only Scalia could say, right? I mean, I'm looking forward to see if Amy Coney Barrett has
I
some of
hope she
those kind of
does.
rhetorical nuggets that will bless America, in the future. But you're right. That's it is very important that that gets clarified, what the court is for, because we do have an executive branch that has seized incredible amounts of power. We do have a legislative branch that is basically going completely off majority. I mean, you mentioned, for example, that her confirmation was very partisanly decided, and it's some of the most in history. It's not the most in recent history, for
Yeah.
example. And this is a really, recent sort of reality. And we could talk about the legacy of Robert Bork again, as so many have, but you really see this. The worldview underlying originalism too is very important, because one of the worldview assumptions underlying a more progressive vision of the judiciary, it can really be seen in a speech that was given by Justice Sonia Sotomayor at Harvard University years ago. In fact, this was something that came up during her confirmation hearings. And she said, and I quote, "To judge is an exercise of power." And that's not a taken out of context quote. People might remember that when President Obama nominated Sotomayor, that her line about whether there is a wiser decision that people would come to because of their minority status or their oppressed status, and would this mean that she would rule in kind of reversed racist sort of ways? And President Obama said, hey, just go read the speech in context and you'll feel better. And so I actually did that. I read the speech in context and I felt way worse, because what I actually saw in Justice Sotomayor was two things. First is basically a application of the ideas of a French postmodern philosopher named Michel Foucault, who basically sees any exercise and interpretation as an exercise of power and imposition.
Mm.
And then secondly, because embedded in that is an inherent, and this is something we saw from Justice Kennedy, was an inherent chronological snobbery, right? That we're more moral than the people before us. We're more tolerant. We are more accepting. And it really is this sense. And by the way, that phrase chronological snobbery is a C.S. Lewis phrase. So I get to quote him before you do today. So haha.
Well done. Although I think Owen Barfield might have come up with that one first, and then Lewis appropriated it.
Oh, is that right? Well, I just learned something. So there you go. But it still was Lewis. I'm quoting Lewis. I'm not quoting whoever that other guy was.
There you go.
But there is a sense then that anything done in the past was necessarily worse, and anything done now is necessarily better. And technologically, that phrase was, I think initially applied. And if you see it in Lewis, he's talking about technology and just our ability to manipulate the universe. But how it's applied in so many decisions in the last decade or so is on moral issues, that we're somehow morally better. And that's a really dangerous snobbery. That's a really dangerous chronological arrogance to embrace. And so there's a deep worldview divide here between these two judicial philosophies. And, what you've got is a pretty balanced court as far as that philosophy goes, because you certainly have a conservative majority on some issues, but you don't see in the Chief Justice, for example, that sort of originalism. What you do is you see certainly a progressivism by the left wing of the court. You see from Clarence Thomas, from Kavanaugh. We'll still see about Gorsuch. It's still not maybe super clear in some of his decisions, but certainly from Amy Coney Barrett, at least according to what she said. We'll have to see how she rules. That's one of the lessons you learn from these things, is what people say and what they do is completely different in the court. But then you have kind of this middle ground of a pragmatism, and my understanding of the Chief Justice is he's trying to protect the integrity and future of the court, and that's his top priority. Right. So it's going to be interesting to see, but there is a deep divide in these judicial philosophies.
The divide in the judicial philosophies, I think, John, will eventually determine the fate of the court itself. We've got open talk now by leading Democrats of expanding the court and packing it. So so expanding the number of justices. And the last time I can remember in my history class anything like this happening was with FDR, when he couldn't get his way with the New Deal. And the idea is that, well, we're just going to fill the Supreme Court with new justices, expand the roster, and they'll rule in support of whatever policies the president who appointed them wants. The problem with that is that it utterly destroys the credibility of the Supreme Court as an arbiter of legal disputes, because the next president could just pack the court more and so, sort of make it go his way. So that's tremendously dangerous. And originalism, I believe, allows us to return to the original purpose of the court and restore its dignity, much more even than a Justice Roberts would, by respecting precedent, which is his big thing. He wants to respect the court's prior decisions and not radically go against them. But ultimately, if those decisions are overreaches of the court's constitutional authority and what the Constitution actually says, then they ought to be vacated and reversed. And I hope that's the sort of performance we'll see from Justice Barrett and from the fingers crossed conservative majority in the next few years.
Something worth mentioning, this isn't necessarily a worldview point, but a pragmatic point reflecting this is, and I owe this thought to a commentator that I heard this week. I'm trying to remember who it is. I think it was on a National Review podcast, perhaps. But, mentioning that now that the confirmation has gone forward, that the talk of packing the court now is wide open, right? And I think that was the cause for, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris not saying, you'll find out what we think later. Well, this is later, and now we're finding it out. But if they were really concerned with the argument being made, which is at the time, the court was established, there was far less people in the United States, then the talk that we would hear, for example, from Speaker Pelosi, is that we should expand the House of Representatives, which is the most directly legislative body, directly connected with the people. That is what we would expand, not the court that is to arbitrate between the legislative decisions and the policy priorities of the representative. So I think that's a very, very good point. If we're going to expand one, let's expand across the board, and the one that should be the last to be expanded, if at all, and I would say never, is of course the Supreme Court.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, one other story that came out of the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation process was a tweet by the Girl Scouts of America. And they actually tweeted a congratulation to the 5 Supreme Court justices who have been women so far, Barrett herself being the most recent, and immediately were decried for this congratulatory tweet, highlighting the role of women on the court, which is very bizarre. One of the tweets I saw that ended up forcing them to delete this and apologize said that their tweet was divisive because of Amy Coney Barrett's political persuasion and her judicial philosophy. So you mentioned this earlier in the previous segment, John, but the idea here seems to be that you have credibility as a minority or victim group, whether that's racial or sex or sexual orientation or what have you, exactly until you leave the left-wing reservation politically. Then you're no longer a woman. You're no longer African American. You're no longer gay or what have you. This is a point that Douglas Murray hits in his book, The Madness of Crowds. He spends a lot of time on it, actually. He gives examples of all of these categories where someone was basically stripped of their identity by leftist pundits because they failed to uphold leftist ideology. And that was unquestionably what was happening here with the Girl Scouts and their tweet.
There's so many examples of this recently. I mean, we mentioned Clarence Thomas not really being African American. Andrew Sullivan's not really, gay because, he is questioning cancel culture right now. J.K. Rowling's not really a feminist because, she's questioning that men can become women.
Oh, some of the luminaries of feminism, some of the early great feminists who are still alive have been basically
Oh yeah.
excommunicated by the feminist movement because they're anti-trans.
I always say, look, if Martina Navratilova is not woke enough, neither are you, right? I mean, it's just no way forward. But let's also point out here what we mean of those people that were featured there in that image on that tweet, which celebrated women being given a place on the highest court of the land. Amy Coney Barrett not only was a woman, but she biologically embraces a part of her female nature as a good thing, not something to be resisted or not something that gets in the way of her being fully female. This is a thought that I'm trying to remember. I believe Dr. Angela Franks, who is a Catholic professor, and we've had on the podcast just recently, she's done some remarkable work on Margaret Sanger that she points out is that Margaret Sanger's legacy is that women now think that the part of their biological nature as a woman gets in the way. And that's, of course, the potential for procreation, potential for reproduction, that's actually an obstacle to their femininity. That's actually an obstacle. It gets in the way of them being a woman.
Mm.
And when you look, for example, at Ruth Bader Ginsburg and so on, when you embrace an abortion ideology as, the only way to have true freedom, the only way to have a career, I mean, we hear this, then that's really the argument that's being made, is that being a woman gets in the way of being a woman. And of course, by no means am I suggesting at any level that the procreative potential is all that makes a woman a woman. That's a horrible thing to believe, and it's caused tons of problems throughout history.
But it
I'm
sure
not
is the
saying
most
that,
obvious, unique aspect of womanhood.
but it's observably unique. The body parts, demonstrate it, and the beauty of it, and so on. So that's really what the Girl Scouts now have embraced, and we've already had the Boy Scouts, embrace that. Girls who are still identifying as girls should be able to join the Boy Scouts, and we've had the Girl Scouts say that boys can become Girl Scouts, but only if they identify as girls. So they're not, apparently not as woke as the Boy Scouts are. So this is a stunning thing. I mean, maybe they should all just change their name to Scouts.
I think it's I think it's the direction that they're heading in. And of course, these organizations are bleeding members rapidly because of this. I talked with this back when Warren Cole Smith was on the show. We talked about the decline of the Scouts because that's something that's very dear to him in his own life. And we kind of came to the conclusion that the leaders of these organizations have reached a point where they're willing to sacrifice their very organizations for the approval of the kind of woke police. And I'm not coming down on anyone at the Girl Scouts, because obviously somebody was far enough behind the regularly updated woke ideology that she or he thought that this was a good idea to, just to celebrate
Right.
women in a high role of in a high place of government. And apparently that's not how it works anymore. A woman has to be an adherent of a particular ideology in order to be celebrated as a woman. Otherwise, it's divisive.
It's a real tragedy, and it's kind of a chapter in the story of the evolution of feminism. And I often describe it this way: first wave feminism was bringing up some very important injustices and fixing them culturally. And this was an appeal to the equality of men and women in rights. Second wave feminism, which somewhere in the middle there got hijacked by the sexual revolution, then evolved from an equality of rights to an equality of roles. And that was a mixed bag. I mean, there were certainly some in first wave feminism, rights that women should have had that they didn't have, and it was a dehumanizing sort of cultural situation. And there were roles that women were being left out of that really make no sense, in kind of where culture was in the middle of the 20th century. But that was a mixed bag, because roles touch on design, and that blurred, kind of the distinctions between men and women, which of course is now where we're at in what might be called third wave feminism, which is men and women are interchangeable fully in reality itself. And there's really nothing to being a man, nothing to being a woman other than what I internally sense or what I externally proclaim. And that's all there is to it. And that's a denial of observable realities, as you said, biology and so on. But it's a real loss for the God-given goodness of maleness and femaleness distinctly. The good parts of who we are because of the way God made us. And of course, when God made us, he proclaimed us very good. And there's a whole lot of very good in how human beings were made in the image and likeness of God.
And one of the other identity issues that has just consumed this year and is consuming our culture right now is the issue of race. And there was a story this week that in many ways follows a familiar pattern by now, John, something that's just become a drumbeat over the course of this year, where there was a police shooting.
Mm-hmm.
A black man was killed in the process of that shooting. And then there was a massive outcry. And this occurred in Philadelphia. Walter Wallace was the name of the man who died, and the circumstances around it are just tremendously tragic. I watched the video. I hate watching these videos, but I'm trying
Right.
to I'm trying to really get a sense of what actually happened. And in this case, it seems to me, based on what we have, that this was a case where the police officers were trying to defend themselves against a guy who had a knife. And it sounds like in this case, this guy was someone who suffered from mental illness. His mother, as I understand it, had actually called 911 to get him some help and get him restrained. And the cops showed up first and ended up having to defend themselves, and that took his life. And in the wake of this, of course, we have demonstrations that turned violent, and there was looting, and there was rioting, and now, of course, Philadelphia has imposed a curfew starting, I believe, last night or tonight, as we record this on Thursday. That's designed to respond to this. And I love what the mayor of Philadelphia, Jim Kenney, said in the announcement. He actually said, "Look, guys, this is a huge loss for the peaceful protesters who just want to come out and exercise their First Amendment rights and protest police brutality and call for systemic reform in the police, because all these bad actors who just want to come out and destroy stuff and steal things are making it impossible for them to get that message across." So there's a lot to talk about here, John. We've mentioned it before. We've talked about the issue of systemic injustice. I don't think this is an instance of that. More evidence could emerge, and that's happened in many of these cases. But honestly, as I see it, the two big issues here are: one, we need to figure out how to talk about systemic injustice without every single issue becoming automatically subsumed under that banner, as if it's always a manifestation of police brutality. And the second thing is really to learn to think about individual cases with the evidence, and not to look at the colors of the skin of the individuals involved and just automatically draw conclusions from that, because that has no end. It will just keep getting worse and worse, and the riots will continue.
Yeah, and I think those are two good points, and I'd add a third one, which is that we have to, if we're going to accept a culture that continually breaks down, and where the local resources of governing ourselves, helping young people emerge into healthy adults. We have an epidemic of mental illness in our country, and it's directly tied to the breakdown of family, breakdown of institutions, our inability to handle it. Now, look, we can argue that we shouldn't, that, really the solution is back there. Well, unless we're going to deal with that solution back there, right now, we don't have the resources to properly talk about mental illness. There's still so much to come out about this particular case. And as you said, video evidence has overturned what we've thought about things a number of times, and
Right.
in both directions. And it's hard to know. But it is a tragic thing when a mental illness incident is responded to by police, and police have a limited amount of resources to bring to bear. Now, this mentally ill individual was also violent. And so what do you do about that? And, it's a big old mess, but the solution is not going to be found in judging every incident and putting it in the same bucket. The incident is going to have to be the solution is going to have to be found by going upstream and figuring out what is breaking. This is the question Chuck Colson asked about the prison.
Mm.
What was breaking in culture that was leading to the prison population exploding, and how can Christians run into the brokenness upstream? We've got the same issue. Look, we heard from a listener today, this week, about a commentary we did on euthanasia and the the coronavirus, COVID-19, and they said, look, this commentary is exactly right, and we're not good at caring for people who are elderly and infirmed. We're not, and yet we have an aging population, and we're going to have to figure out that math, and the church can lead on this. The same thing with mental illness. We're not a culture that knows how to deal with mental illness. We're a culture where the more lawless your culture is, the more militarized your police will become. That's a bad formula for any sort of kind resolution and redemption of situations like this. And it's not the sort of culture you want to live in. You don't want to live in a culture where the mayor has to impose curfews. You don't want to live in a culture or in a city where you have to have the president call in the National Guard. And this is all of this points to a brokenness in the culture that is so far upstream from these individual incidents till we get up that far, and until we bring in true hope and true forgiveness and true restoration and true healing. We're going to continue to go situation by situation, shaking our heads and going, man, I wish this weren't the case. And it's tragic. And what can we do? We got to go to the source of the issue.
Well, I appreciate you dropping the name of my new podcast, Upstream, twice there, John. And I hope you check that out, folks.
Shoot, I was suckered into it.
That's ultimately what we're about here. That's what we're doing, is we're trying to get to the heart of what's causing these issues in the tradition of Chuck Colson, in the tradition of Abraham Kuyper and other thinkers who've believed from their hearts that worldview matters, and that the way you think about the big questions of life impacts every area of our lives, including politics. And that's what we're seeing right now, especially. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. Another fascinating story I wanted to hit this week, John, is it's an article in the Washington Post by sociologist Brad Wilcox. And he actually reports that marriages are doing better and divorces are down in 2020, despite a lot of punditry that sort of said, divorces are going to skyrocket, couples are going to get tired of each other, marriages are going to fall apart, coronavirus, COVID-19 is going to be terrible for families. Well, it turns out that American families, at least to some extent, have gotten stronger, not weaker. And that's in multiple metrics. Not only are couples reporting that they're doing better together, and more couples are saying that their marriages are on strong foundations, but divorce filings have gone down. Now, my first instinct looking at this would be to say, at least with a divorce statistic, that they just can't get to the court. They can't file for divorce, and they're sort of waiting. But the metric that couples are reporting being happier in their marriages, in the midst of quarantine, in the midst of lockdowns, in the midst of mask mandates, all that is really very interesting. And Wilcox is very conservative with his speculation on what may be causing this. He mentions that there is evidence of an increase in husbands spending time at home, helping out in the house, helping out with the kids. This is one possible contributing factor in here. And I just think it's really cool, good news, and it's a counterintuitive good news, and it's maybe an opportunity for us to talk about what exactly could be going on here.
Yeah, it is. What a fascinating story. I saw it and I felt guilty because I was the one who made the joke early on. It's like, in 9 months we're going to have a whole lot more babies and a whole lot more divorces. Ha ha ha. And I was wrong.
And then when they turn 13, we're going to be able to call them quarantines.
Yeah. Well, I think that might still happen. We haven't heard about the increase in pregnancies, but we'll see. The history is on our side on that prediction. But this is I think such good news. And there's still data to come in, and there's still reasons to come in. But let me at least say what might be behind it. And I find this super refreshing. We approach marriage, first of all, as a temporary arrangement based on a consumer mindset. In other words, we consume based on our abilities to make infinite choices by what we think will make us happy. And marriage has been defined down that way in so many contexts. Now, we could also talk about, the Disney princess problem of, who's going to fulfill your heart and who's going to, complete you, as Jerry Maguire said, and that sort of stuff. And of course, I often joke with students when they were like, well, I'm not sure I'm ready to get married. I'm like, of course you're not ready to get married. No one's ready. You know what makes you ready to get married? Getting married. In other words, there's not like this transactional view of this that makes any sense. And when you are actually uh forced to think about marriage, first of all, together, right? In other words, just working it out. And by the way, this also brings to mind one of the early lies of the sexual revolution, that the kids will be fine, was in No Fault Divorce, where we're like, oh, kids need happy parents, not married parents. And it turned out to be completely false, except in cases of abuse. That we think that somehow happiness is the measure of all things, as opposed to, we're in this together. And together, and this might have also, Shane, something to do with the pimp your crib trend that happened during, and I'm quoting a podcast called Robin Hood Snacks. They've been talking about this, like pimp your crib. We've seen Home Depot and Big Lots and Restoration Hardware and all these stocks go up. Anything that has to do with, because I did it, right? I don't know if you did it. I sat at home during quarantine, before and after work, and thought, I can fix that, or I should change
for
that.
anyone watching the video version of this podcast, you'll notice that a certain backdrop of mine has improved recently, and that's because of Home Depot. It's because
improved.
I pimped my crib.
I mean, look at the color coordination there. It's even weird, and it's patriotic. And but here's the difference of that. When you are working together towards a project, I remember realizing this, the birth of our first child, Abigail, after a 30-hour labor. It was brutal. And I never, and of course we hadn't been married that long, and there's been other experiences since, but I realized that our attention wasn't on each other. Our attention was towards this common goal of bringing this child into the world. And I never felt more married, because we were in this together. And we were in this together, kind of looking at each other, saying, you make me happy, you make me happy, you make me happy. It's our attention was forward. And might the pimp your crib trend be a way that married couples are looking forward together and doing it together? And it's less about what I'm expecting of you and what you're expecting of me. That's my hope. And by the way, I think the romanticization, the hyper romanticization, I don't even know how you say that word, or I couldn't spell it, it has been devastating for marriage, because it basically says, get married when you're happy, stop being married when you're not happy, move on. It's a choice, as if the goal of marriage is happiness. C.S. Lewis told us, twice on C.S. Lewis before you've thrown in one. C.S. Lewis told us that happiness is a byproduct, not a goal. You never get happiness by going after it. You get happiness as a byproduct for going after something that's bigger than yourself.
Well, he also said that love results very often from acting as if you love someone. So the best step, the best thing you can do to start loving someone is not to try to sit and work up the feelings of love that you need to act. It's to start acting, act like you
just love
them.
someone,
and then all of a sudden you'll
them.
find that the feelings begin to follow. And I think that's probably exactly what's going on here. This is my theory. I share it with you. I think you're right on the money, John. Unstable times historically have resulted in lower divorce rates. Wilcox points out that the 2008 financial crash and the subsequent recession resulted in a lower divorce rate, weirdly. And it may be that spouses are considering it wiser to sort of hunker down instead of losing the security that they have together in tough times, which means that they have to start acting like they love each other in order to live together. And a funny thing happens sometimes when you act like you love someone. You really begin loving them. And that may be exactly what we're looking at here. The passing of ships in the night that happens when couples' lives are centered outside the home, somewhere else with other people, is now much less than it was before. And despite the financial hardship that results from not being able to go to work, the difference it makes to simply be with your spouse, to be at home, to be working toward a common goal together, and to have shared priorities apparently is discernible by statistics. You can see it, you can measure it in the space of just a few months. And that, I mean, that's massive. That's significant. What a lesson to take from the numbers on an otherwise really awful year.
Well, yeah, that's right. Maybe we're wrong, and it's just because more husbands are doing more housework, and it's less
Maybe so.
frustrating for everyone. Which is still, by the way, if you don't feel like it, do it anyway. So maybe that's the maybe.
Well,
That's
look, my work around the house is I squish roaches, I open jars, and I do stuff that involves power tools. So that's
good heavens, and you grunt. No, man, do some dishes, do some.
Got to do the Tim Allen grunt.
Yeah. I do the laundry, for the record. So,
all right, there you go. Well, let's move on to our recommendations here, John. We've made a little custom of giving 1 or 2 or 3 or 8 recommendations at the end of each of these Breakpoint This Week programs. And this week, I want to recommend a great series of YouTube videos / podcast by my friend and someone I really admire, Aleister Roberts. I had him on the Breakpoint podcast a while back. He's a guy who works with Theopolis and the Davenant Institute. He's a good friend and close associate of Peter Leithart. And this guy just loves the Bible. I mean, he really loves the Bible. And he's profoundly influenced by Leithart, by guys like James Jordan. And his specialty is really seeing the interconnectedness and themes of the Bible, seeing it as literature, and helping you pick up on all the cues that the authors of Scripture have littered throughout the text that help us to understand the point they're making, the great meaning that overarches the whole story. And so he's doing this series of YouTube videos, which are actually just his podcast filmed, kind of like we do here, where he's going through the entire Bible, passage by passage. And I think he's shooting to have it done in a year. It may not be quite done by that time frame, but he's gone through much of the Old Testament and much of the New Testament and highlighted all these themes, all these patterns, all these cross references of Scripture that you might not have otherwise noticed. So I'll give you an example here that was really cool. In Genesis, in the story of Joseph, Joseph falls into a series of pits. The first one is the one his brothers throw him into before they decide to sell him into slavery. And the second is in Pharaoh's jail because of the malice of someone else, either his brothers or Potiphar's wife. In both cases, his clothes are subsequently presented as evidence by those who were responsible for putting him in that pit. And then, of course, he rises out of that pit in both cases to go on to greater responsibility and authority. Now, what is the author of Genesis doing here? What are we being told? Well, Aleister unpacks that. He says there's a lot of meaning in this kind of recapitulation of the pattern of the story. And the same thing is true throughout the Bible. Genesis is a particularly strong example of it because we see that recapitulation happening with Eden narratives repeating, the theme of an Adam who's commissioned to go and fill the earth. I didn't know this until fairly recently, but Noah, after the flood, he and his family land there. They go out to start anew, and God gives them a commission. He says, "Go and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Same thing he said to Adam.
Yeah.
Noah is a new Adam figure. He's kind of the new king of the world there. These are cool themes that really point ultimately to the culmination of Scripture in Christ, because you see foretastes or foreshadowings of all that Christ does in all of these figures. And Aleister is excellent at bringing those out. Plus, he's got a really nougaty British accent that's fun to listen to, and his illustrations are always just fantastic. So I recommend Aleister Roberts. His YouTube channel is his name, and he's got about 1,000. He's got way more than that at this point, videos up there going through the Bible and dealing with other subjects too. So,
and what's the name of the podcast if people want to listen to it?
Aleister's Adversaria.
Oh, good heavens. We'll have to put that on the show notes so people can get it. You know, what's interesting is a couple chapters after Noah gets that instruction is the Tower of Babel. And
Right.
The reason God investigates that project, according to the text, and on flannel graph, I always heard in Sunday schools that, God didn't like tall buildings or something like that. But it actually says
they might actually get up here. I can't let them keep building this thing.
Yeah. Well, what they said, what the text says is that they gathered all in one plane. In other words, the dispersion of the languages was an act of mercy, because God says they shouldn't do everything that comes into their mind, and this will stop them. And secondly, he's scattering them across the face of the earth because they hadn't done what God had commanded Noah to do, which is fill the earth. And so there's a whole kind of scattering and gathering that's happening there, which is really interesting. I'm going to recommend something far less spiritual, but something far also quite edifying. And I was just reminded of this from a friend who was at a gathering, and he texted me a video of a guy that he had just met. My friend Steve did, and said, "Hey, you got to hear this." And the guy was talking about a relationship that he had had in Alaska when he was in his 20s with a guy named Kenny Sailors. Now, Kenny Sailors is not a name that many people will recognize. If you're a faithful listener to Breakpoint, our commentaries, it'll sound a little bit familiar because we talked about this. And I think I had the director on the Breakpoint podcast. A guy named Kenny Sailors is the guy who invented the jump shot and in basketball. And it's because he was 5'9", his brother was 6'4", and they play basketball in Wyoming at their Wyoming home. And back then everyone was doing the two-handed set shot, and his brother kept blocking it. So Kenny innovated this jump shot, literally jumping in the air and being able to shoot over his brother, perfected it. His brother was like, there's something there. And Kenny goes on to play for Wyoming. He wins a national championship. He plays for the first 4 years in the NBA. And this is in the 40s and early 50s. After, by the way, going overseas and fighting the war. I mean, it's just a remarkable story, the whole thing. And what's really beautiful about this story is that it's really less about the jump shot, and it's more about a life really well lived. And it's a criminal act that he's not yet in the Hall of Fame. So I'm just going to put that advocacy out there. He should be in the Hall of Fame. He's not. I don't know why. It's crazy. But Kenny Sailor's jump shot, I love the film. And I just was reminded about it just in time for the recommendation today, when my friend was like, "Hey, I just met this guy who was in his 20s, and Kenny was in his 60s, and they coached track and field in Alaska together." And he's like, we had these 3-hour car rides to go to these, other schools, because every school in Alaska is hours and hours apart, to do these track meets. And he'd hear all these stories about the NBA and about the war and about college championships. And he's like, Kenny Sailors was the real deal. I always love it when you kind of have a high opinion of someone, and then a completely independent comes through and is like, that's the real deal. I've heard the opposite about Rudy. So it makes me feel so good about Kenny Sailors, that he's sorry to ruin your dream there, Shane, but Kenny Sailors is the real deal, was the real deal. He passed away a couple years ago, but the movie's The Jump Shot. So that's my recommendation for the week.
I can't believe you're going to leave me with that ominous warning about Rudy.
Oh man,
this wonderful, beautiful movie starring Samwise Gamgee. I mean, come on, you can't do that to me.
My friend, what's the guy's name that plays him?
Sean Astin.
Somebody saw him on screen and asked his son, "Now who is that?" And his son was like, "That's Samwise Rudy."
Right, Samwise. No, I saw one where it was like, they said, "That's Rudy." Or the guy from Stranger Things, and the response was, "Listen up, Samwise Gamgee did not walk all the way to Mordor and carry Frodo up Mount Doom and then walk all the way home just to be recognized as Bob from Stranger Things and Rudy. Come on, you can't do that." Well, that wraps it up for today, folks. Visit breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories that we've mentioned today on the program, as well as a wealth of always fresh resources to help you think and live like a Christian in today's culture. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.